Jonaki Bhattacharyya, who comes to us from Victoria, British Columbia. And she's an ethnoecologist and environmental planner. What does that have to do with horses and equitation science? We'll soon find out. Katrina Merkes has known her for some time and had her come and lecture. She works closely with Indigenous peoples and other communities to lead applied research on relationships between people from different cultures, wildlife, and the land in Canada. She's adjunct faculty at 2 universities in British Columbia and a senior researcher with the Firelight Group. So, Dr. Bhattacharya, please.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. I really appreciate all of you turning out tonight. I know it's been a fascinating and engaging and long day with lots of information. So I'm going to try to honor the fact that you came by keeping the text on the slides to a minimum and bringing a sort of a storied approach tonight. And if I time it properly, then hopefully we'll have time for questions and maybe some discussion. I'd like to just, in addition to thanking all of you for being here, to thank the organizers for this event, Katrina especially. It's been a true pleasure to be here and a privilege. University of Guelph for hosting us. And I'd like to extend a thank you to the Indigenous people whose territory we're on. I might pronounce these wrong, but the Haudenosaunee, Attawanderong, and Anishinaabewaki. So I'm going to guess that, like many of you, horses were a formative part of who I am growing up and as an adult. For me, I feel that I learned to appreciate nature from horseback and from being with horses. And it was through their ears as I was on trail rides and feeling their muscle tension that I started to realize they were sensing things that I couldn't see. They were responding to birds in the bushes, to squirrels, to little rustles. And I felt like they improved my appreciation for the natural world around me and taught me to look beyond the obvious. And it made me think, we interact with horses. These are animals that we've bred for thousands of years to be our partners. And we enjoy them that way. And at the same time, they've evolved over millennia as wild prey animals to survive and to be resilient. And they are incredibly adaptable and resilient. So I wonder sometimes whether that's part of the allure of wild horses. Is that we feel this affinity for them because we feel we know them so well. And yet, we have the opportunity when we're talking about wild horses to observe animals that are exercising agency. They're making their own decisions. They're out there on the land, and they're choosing what to do, and that's out of our reach. It's these animals that we love and feel we know, but they're beyond our control, and that's pretty magical. So I grew up riding. I grew up working in barns in order to ride and spending long summer days in fields with the horses just to be near them. And decades later, I was lucky enough as a graduate student to go out and study wild horses. And so I found myself hiking on foot this time down trails made by wild horses in the bush in the backcountry of BC. And that's what I'd like to share with you a little bit about today. So, to start with, 3 things we'll kind of focus on today. One is a lot of people don't realize that there are wild horses in Canada. I didn't really know that before I started studying them. I knew they were in the States. I heard a lot about those. Another thing that people don't often know is that in many parts of Canada, those horses that are ranging freely or wild are super controversial. Not everybody loves them. And we'll get to that. And they're the subject of a lot of attention. Magazines, the controversy, politics. And finally, wild horses in British Columbia, where I did my research and where I want to focus today, have long been part of Indigenous peoples' cultures. And as part of that, the horses are wrapped up in a centuries-old struggle over land and people's agency and political autonomy that is highly relevant today. So, before we go any further, I mean, as you probably all know, there are free-roaming horses all over the world. These are just pictures from a few places. I mean, they're in the Americas, they're in New Zealand, they're in Australia, Africa, Europe, Asia. I learned after my dad went on a cruise, there are even free-roaming horses on Easter Island. And they're in Canada. So in some places they evolved with those ecosystems. In other places they did not. And they were introduced or reintroduced by people, often by European explorers. Horses are highly adaptable animals, which sometimes makes me giggle when I think about some of the fussy horses that I've dealt with in the barn who would turn their nose up if I didn't have just the right amount of water on their hay for the night. But but they can adapt to some extreme environments. And while there are vast differences between animals, they have different impacts depending on the ecosystems that they're in. So in some areas, they're well adapted, plants respond well, everything is fine. In other areas, they can actually be incredibly damaging. And I think that one of the things that was interesting for me studying this topic is that as a horse person, I love horses like the next person, but I also enjoy wearing the scientist's hat and looking at it objectively and thinking, where might they be damaging the environment? Just because we love them doesn't mean that we have to think that they are always in the right place at the right time. So in Canada, often we hear about Sable Island wild horses. Is that somewhat familiar? It's an island off the Sandspit Island off the east coast of Canada. They're protected and they've been heavily studied. There's ponies that have been there for a long time. There's also free-ranging horses in the western prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in BC. And this article in Canadian Geographic came out about the ones that I was studying in BC. I didn't find this article, though, until after I started looking. My first realization that there were horses roaming freely around BC was actually, I was doing field work with biologists, and I kept noticing when we would be on First Nations land that I would just see horses around. And it wouldn't always, they weren't in paddocks, which is what I'd grown up with. And one day I was literally hunched over counting butterflies on a plant in the South Okanagan, and this small herd of horses went thundering by, and I said, well, whose are those? Where did they come from? And the biologist I was with was really grumpy about it. He was like, those horses, they just wreck everything. I wish that people would just keep them under control. And I said, well, whose are they? And he was a buddy with folks in the local First Nation whose land we were on, and he said, well, they belong to the Soyuz people. But I really wish they'd keep them in paddocks. So when I got the chance to look into wild horses, I hit on what for me was the mother lode of interesting controversy. And that was in, having a little bit of a sticky button issue here. That was in, no? Yes? Say. Tokodiin territory. So the Tokodiin First Nation are a people located in south central British Columbia. And they were using horses as conservation icons. So this article that came out in Canadian Geographic was part of a campaign that they were waging to protect their lands from logging. They were fighting for their right to steward their own lands, including the horses that roamed wild on their land. They were fighting against forestry that they didn't have any control over because the provincial government considered this crown land and was exercising the right. Now, something that we'll come back to later that's important to know is that unlike many other parts of Canada, in many areas of BC, Indigenous lands are unceded territory. There were no treaties signed. It was never given up. People never, in any way, formally or informally gave up the right to manage their own territories. So there's a conflict historically that's never been resolved over who has the right to that land and all the animals on it. So the critics of this horse, the First Nations were saying, we need, everybody's got grizzly bears in BC. We have grizzlies, but not everybody has horses, like wild horses. That's what's going to get us the publicity we need to save and protect this land from the logging. The critics were from different camps, and the controversy was stemming partly, it was partly economic, and also, interestingly, from the conservation biology community, of which I was a part, because a lot of people felt that horses are an introduced species in Canada and are damaging to the environment, and therefore people who wanted to protect the land were appalled that this species was being used, that people were citing horses as a reason to protect the land. Now, what got me about this and what I found really interesting was that the claim is that horses are not legitimate because they are non-native. So what you have is, forgive my crassness here, but you have native people defending the right of horses to be on the land, and you have non-native people criticizing the horses and saying they are illegitimate because they're not native. And I thought, oh, I gotta go there. That's just too good to pass up. So as a horse person, as a conservationist, as a cultural ecologist, this was just exciting to me. It was a hot spot. I wanted to know, what were the horses really like? What was the reality on the ground? Were they damaging it? What was behind all those competing narratives? And could science and research help? Now I need to preface this by saying, obviously, I don't speak for the Chilcotin people. I can't. They have strong voices. These days I work for them. And so I do want to say that everything I tell you tonight is my perspective. I wanted to try to frame it as insights and highlights the things that I learned, which is why it's going to be a little bit personalized. But their voices are out there. And you can start increasingly look things up. We'll try to watch a little movie trailer that they're producing themselves to get their voices in. And the only text you will see tonight is some quotations so that we can have Chilcotin voices here with us. So let's switch up for a moment because this is place-based research and I'm going to get to the juicy horsey bits soon. These are some of the horses you will see in that valley, but to understand the horses, I need to introduce you to the place and the people. So we're going to take a little journey for 5 minutes. Bear with me. We're going to fly out west. If you're like me, you've got camping gear stored in Victoria or Vancouver, so you're going to get all your stuff together, and we're going to pack about a month's worth of food and camping gear before we take this trip into the interior to do some research. We're going to drive for 2 days up through the Lower Mainland, through the Caribou region, to a town of Williams Lake. Williams Lake is about a 1-day drive. Last stop for perishable foods. Pack your eggs carefully because we're going off-road. And then we're going to drive for another day to get into Chilcotin territory. The first hour is paved. After that, we leave the pavement, and we drive for 2 more hours on logging roads. And we start to get close to this place, to Nemaya Valley. We're going to stop in at the community, and I'll introduce you to some of those community members there. This is what Nemaya Valley looks like. This is Silas. He is a mountain who was once a man. He watches over the valley, and if you're rude or disrespectful, bad things happen to you. There is a story, the very first story that was shared with me when I went there, quite deliberately, was about an early white settler who came to the area and was disrespectful of local people. And the mountain made a terrible snowstorm come down on him. He lost all his cattle and he left. But he left his horses behind these days. And they were welcome. We'll come back to the community and visit people, but the area where the horses hang out, that's where we want to get to. So now we get to the end of the road. And this is where you hope your eggs are well packed, because we're going to travel another, it's only 25 kilometers into the bush. But we're off-roading. It might take 4 hours because we have to cut our way in. There's a lot of fallen trees. And when we get there, you're going to start meeting incredible wildlife. The only human footprints you're going to be seeing these days are your own. There is a suite of wildlife in this region. And once we get to the research cabin, we park that truck and we're on foot everywhere because there are no roads. There's moose, there's black bears, there's wild horses, like this guy. That was a spring photo. You can see how skinny. And they fatten up nicely by about August. There's black bears, there's grizzlies. I don't have a photo of a grizzly for you because when I did encounter them, I was not taking photographs. There's lynx. There's a grizzly footprint. There's wolves. There's cougars. It's an absolutely abundant ecosystem, more birds than you can imagine. And the horses are there. They're part of it. They're engaged in that ecosystem, living with all of these other wildlife. If we go down into the valley, the Hanikotiin people are one of 6 Chilcotin communities. They live down there. It's a community of about 400 people, many of whom I consider friends now, and they've protected this land for a long, long time. There's many traditional aspects to their way of life down there, but just to avoid stereotyping, I also want to show you, I also want to show you that there's also some really fascinating projects they have going on. So these are folks who can see that the resource extraction industry and fossil fuels have never been a particularly great idea. It's like they're jumping straight from life on horseback to installing one of the largest solar farms in BC, commercial greenhouse operations for food security. They've got some amazing projects going on. So lest we stereotype, there's some really innovative work coming out of that community. And to bring their voices in, I'd like to show you briefly a little video of a movie trailer that they're producing about their relationship with horses and a wagon journey that they're doing to teach youth about traditional ways of travel. And Katrina's going to help me because we had some tech challenges, which... This is the trailer for a movie that is being produced by Hanikotiin about their wagon trip. It's 2 minutes long.
I always hear people come in and they always just call it beautiful or amazing, and a lot of people are just stunned. You can't beat it. You have the backdrop of the coastal mountains, and you have the interior plateau one side. So it's priceless. Horses, we call them cayuse, or wild horse. We have one of the only protected areas for horses in Canada, I believe. But we have Brittany Triangle that those horses are protected for us to use. The wagon trip is one way to use them. Straight up the embankment, just like a car would do an endo. We call ourselves Hanikotiin. Means people in Maya and Chilcotin.
So one thing to keep in mind, we're going to talk about the relationship that Hanikotiin in particular have with horses, and some of the controversies out there, is that working with Indigenous peoples, we are working with people from a different culture. different language, different ways of knowing. And one thing I've really noticed, especially when it comes to the horses, is that as outsiders, there's often a tendency for us to either idealize or to criticize Indigenous folks. And the challenge for all of us is to enter their way of life and their environment with an open mind and curiosity, and not to listen before we start telling people how to do things. So one thing that I should preface is that I work at the intersection of science and Indigenous knowledge. So Indigenous knowledge it's a culturally based different systems of knowledge that people from different cultures have. And part of how we learn about how to work with horses in that environment is learning from the people who have observed them for hundreds of years and combining that with science. So, a traditional way of life, this thing likes to flip forward. People in that environment traditionally, before kind of getting involved in the wage economy in the last 100 years, had seasonal rounds. People moved. It's a very fragile environment. It can't support permanent camps very well. So people moved from areas where they would fish in the summer, collect berries, to areas where they would hunt, and they would move seasonally. And this is going to come back because so do the horses. Horses fit in with this really well when they arrived. Now, people did share oral history of remembering a time before horses. They have traditions that predate the horses. We don't really know when the horses got there, because by the time the first written history from European explorers came about in the early 1800s, they were met by Sokoine people on horseback. So we know that horses were well integrated into society by then. And one of my mentors, Hani Godin, first said, he said, well, think about it. If you're packing a moose out of the bush, that's a lot of work on your own back. If you've got a horse, it's a lot easier. So they integrated horses into their traditional way of life very early and very easily. And when the colonial governments came along and encouraged ranching, they integrated that into their way of life with the horses. So they would actually put up hay in wild meadows and drive small herds of cattle seasonally from the fishing grounds to the winter hunting areas, and then the cows would eat the hay as they came back down. And horses were integral to winter ranching for both First Nations and non-First Nations. Because one of the things I was taught by people out there is that horses will paw through snow to get at the grass underneath. Cattle, not as much. So the tradition for both Indigenous and white ranchers in the region was to turn out the horses during the winter and the cattle, and cowboys would drive them from meadow to meadow. The horses would paw, they'd let them graze for a while, they'd move them off, cattle would go in. That's how they kept them all alive. So there's traditions of free-ranging horses that were sort of ranch horses, sort of domestic, and sort of wild in this region. And this is where you get some of the controversy, because people, I've literally had people say to me, you know, I would be chatting with a friend in a cafe up in this region, and I would use the term wild horses. And I've been angrily interrupted by someone from another table and said, they're feral, they're all feral, they're not wild. So, you know, I sort of thought, okay, I look into this. Feral means something that was domestic and has been reintroduced to the wild. Sometimes in my publications, I tend to use the term free-ranging because we can capture all sorts of horses. Wild, how do we define it? Do we want to define that by the genetics, by species? Do we want to define it behaviorally? Some animals will behave more wild than the others. It's loose, and so people get really up in arms about the terminology, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with diverse horses in different environments. And I found myself thinking, how many horsey generations does it take before something goes from being wild, feral to wild? I don't really know. There's no answer to that. I did notice that most of the Sokoine people I talked to, were less concerned about whether the term wild or feral was important. They were a little more interested in distinguishing between wild horses and barn horses. So for them, horses that were bred and raised in a barn were one category of horses. Horses that were from the bush and maybe had been brought in, trained, and now lived in the barn, but that was still a wild horse. And that had to do with the traits that those horses exhibited. And, you know, I won't go into it, but one of the things that is important to notice in the way they're talking differently about horses is that wilderness, as a place that is antithetical to people, is kind of a Western construct anyway. So this plays out with the horses. A lot of the First Nations folks that I work with, they quite easily use the term wild, but it doesn't mean that they're, you know, you can be riding a wild horse that you've trained. They don't distinguish in the same way. So I studied horses in a land area known as the Brittany Triangle within this region. It's bounded by two deep river canyons that form the peak of a triangle and a mountain range on the bottom. It's a fairly distinct land unit, and the horses up there have the reputation for being, as people in the community said, more wild, which was very unscientific to my colleagues at the university, but there you go. It had a forest fire 2 years before I got there, and so when I got there, we call this the peekaboo picture. This is the kind of terrain that we were in. We were in burnt forest with the trees still standing, and this beautiful upsurge of nutrients, like of grasses and wildflowers that come after a burn. And the horses were moving around in this. There's meadows and lakes that they graze in, sort of interspersed through this forest ecosystem. And, you know, the first time I went up there, I'd seen wild horses in some of the clear cuts when we drove in. And you can stop the car, and as long as you stay in the car, they'll kind of keep looking at you and munching. And if you get out of the car and start walking towards them, then they'll take off. And so I thought, okay, well, those are some of the horses that people talk about as wild. Those are usually the ones that get filmed, because if you have a film crew, they're accessible. But I wanted to see these really wild horses. I can tell you that I hiked for 2 weeks before seeing any, because I had to learn how to stalk like a hunter. They are so sensitive that if the wind takes your scent to them, you'll still be in the forest and all you'll hear is the thundering hooves as they run away. And people in the community would tease me and they'd say, oh yeah, you'll see a lot of bums. Sorry, it's flipping, but I saw a lot of bums. But I was really excited when I first started seeing them. So there was a lot of learning to test which way the wind is going, stopping when we know we're getting near a meadow, sometimes literally belly crawling through the bush, and then we started to see them. And we saw a variety. This is a really skinny mare one spring. I found her really interesting. She's got a foal, I think, that was quite young, and we found her with Stallion separated from the rest of the band. He'd actually left 2 other mares with yearlings. And we had and taken her, I think he was guarding her quite closely to try to make sure that she could feed. I don't know, because they rejoined the rest of their group a little later. The herd dynamics are fascinating for these horses. So when people say they're more wild, what we noticed was, unlike those ones we saw from the truck, when they perceived us coming, the mares will take the foals, they'll move off to the far end of the meadow, and they'll kind of gather the foals nearby. They're all on alert. The stallions make this blowing snort that I hadn't heard too much from my domestic horses, but it might have been because I was always around school ponies. It sounds to me like a whale blowing. And they will, if they can't tell what the threat is, the stallion would actually advance towards us. And I worked with one biologist who had cut out felt wolf ears on a baseball field. He made me promise not to take photos, I wish I had anyway. And he would crouch down in the grass and howl like a wolf. And then get his camera out because the stallions would just come in. If they thought there was a lone wolf, they can take a lone wolf. And they will posture and come charging in and challenge, and he would get the most amazing photographs. It's usually the lead mare's decision when she wants to take off, and at a certain point, they'll move off into the forest. The movement that these horses have, this is where I get to gush. I'm usually talking about horses to a bunch of like ecologists who don't know horses, and now I get to finally talk to horse people. So as a dressage rider, the movement I've seen on some of these animals is absolutely phenomenal. The terrain in a burned forest like this, with ankle-turning terrain, like I've injured myself a few times. There's holes where roots have burned out from trees, and there's kind of like spikes sticking up where small trees that burned have broken off and the base is still there. There's rocks. You have to be careful when you're hiking. And these horses will move through there at a canter. I've seen them do a passage that would make a dressage rider proud. So it's really fascinating to watch these animals at ease in that environment. And indeed, that's what I learned was, so the Haudenosaunee people who I interviewed, they valued a number of these traits in the wild horses. They would talk about, they'd be like, yeah, well, sometimes we have to work with barn horses, but the wild horses, they're amazing. And some of the traits that let's just see if we can get that to the next one, that they talked about really enjoying and appreciating was the wild horses, if they could bring them in and train them, were tough, they were fast, sure-footed, they knew the terrain, you can ride them through that terrain and they'll handle it. They're easy keepers. This is important for hunting and pack trips. So when you have to go out into alpine terrain for sometimes a week, 2 weeks at a time to go hunting, with these horses, they know what to eat in that environment. They'll keep their condition. They don't need to pack grain or hay. These horses can stay strong in that environment because they understand what to eat. Another interesting thing was that people said these horses are wildlife savvy. This ties in with the presentation earlier today on safari and bush ponies. And I had a number of seasoned old horsemen tell me that they've had encounters where they didn't know there was something up ahead. Their horse would stop, plant its feet, and absolutely refuse to go forward. And that's what a true partnership starts to look like. The trust was there, and they would move off, and finally, if the horse was giving strong enough signals, they'd just back off and go around, and they would find later, maybe it had been a grizzly on a carcass, maybe it had been something else, but those horses knew. And they also felt these horses wouldn't freak out if they did run into something by surprise, which in that environment can mean the difference between life and death for you. And finally, strong hooves was another trait. So when you're packing, you know, they don't always have the wild horses these days, but these are things that are appreciated. And that idea of being tough and fast also helps when you're racing your buddies for a nice purse at the end of the day. I love this photo because all three of those guys are political leaders. I'm going to talk a little later about a landmark court case that was led by former Chief Roger William. He's the guy in the black hat in the back. And I always thought, I wonder what Canadian politics would be like if all our leaders spent their spare time like this. So racing horses, you know, part of that tradition actually comes from chasing wild horses, because to get the wild horses, you've got to have fast, tough, good horses that can help you chase them in. There were different methods. That fence there was part of a corral that was a baiting corral. The old gentleman standing there with my research assistant explained how he had been given fishing gear at one point. Well, Chilcotin had their own way of fishing. So he decided to use the fishing weights to catch horses. And he had it, so he had a spring-loaded tripwire that in the wintertime they would just put out some hay and horses would come in and they would just kind of trip the wire, the gate would swing closed and they would catch them that way. There's also a lot of technique amongst the older folks on how to catch wild horses. They would talk about waiting until the snow crust was just right at the right time in the winter, that it was deep enough that it would tire them out faster, and you could catch them. And these riders would ride relay style. They would switch out to keep their own horses fresh for sometimes 4 to 6 hours, chasing horses through the bush. How they knew where to meet each other, I don't know. And they'd eventually corral them and be able to catch them. So there's all these traditions. These days, times are changing, people's lifestyles are changing. If you have kids in school and you're working a job that earns you wages, it's kind of difficult to say, I can't come to work today, I have to go chase horses. I don't know when I'll be back. So it's harder to find people who still have those skills, but the communities involving horses in their culture in a number of other ways. They do it to keep the youth healthy. They have gymkhanas. They've declared a wild horse preserve to try to protect that area. They have rangers out on the land, and they use horses to get around. And that memorial I wanted to share with you because 2 years ago in the summer of 2017, there were absolutely massive forest fires that burned this area. And usually horses will get away. It was such a scale that they found a number of them that had burned in the fires. And it was interesting to me that the community put this cross up with the horseshoes on it to honor the horses that were burned. So this is an area where, animals get injured, they live, they die, and people take it in stride, but there was still a strong enough emotional connection to the wild horses that when they saw they had died that way, there's a memorial to them. So just to come back to the controversy, I kind of thought, so what's the rest of the hubbub about? Well, I had to do some science now. Spent some time talking to people and following horses around the bush. Part of it is overgrazing. So this accusation that they're an introduced species, they're damaging the land. So I did a lot of plant measurement, lying around in mosquito-y fields and measuring plants in areas that the horses grazed at different seasons, identifying the plants that they predominantly feed on. And I chose to study in an area where it was just horses, not cattle. Now, a lot of the controversy comes because horses and cows eat very similar diets. And in the areas, this is ranching land. In the areas where you have ranchers who are trying to make a living and they need to turn their cattle out in the spring, and there's already a bunch of horses out there that have grazed it down too low. They're literally losing weight on their cows. They're paying for grazing leases, and this is a thing that has gone back a century, is resentment from the ranching community of free-ranging horses that are threatening their livelihoods. So I thought, well, let's study, if the horses are getting blamed, let's see what they do when they're just on their own, before we start combining their pets with the cattle. The result? Mixed. Some areas overgrazed, other areas not. Primarily in the sample sites that I tested with just horses, they were not overgrazing. This was an area with no fencing. So these were wild horses that could actually move seasonally from meadow to meadow. Left to their own devices, they did not overgraze. Now, this was only a 2-year study. At that time, drought, climate change one of the things we found was that there are other ecological drivers. So in times of scarcity, yeah, they'll overgraze and they can do some damage. Horses tend to make trails. Cattle disperse. So you will find distinctive trails that horses, they'll move in a line. They don't kind of spread out the same way cows do. What was interesting was other wildlife were using those trails. So in some ways, although that's an impact on the soil, it raises questions about whether they're actually saving other wildlife energy. This area down in the down in the corner there, that is an area where there were cows and horses, and you can see it's totally overgrazed, like just blown out. Whereas I would find where it was just horses and they had freedom to move, I would find a lot of grazed patches like this, where you can tell it's been eaten, but they'll kind of nibble and move on. Areas that were not overgrazed, I mean, this is me sitting surrounded by grass almost as tall as my shoulders, and we would find grass nesting bird nests still there amongst areas that have been grazed. So this is an evidence of an area that's not heavily impacted. Comparatively then, the horses can have negative impacts, but really, honestly, the biggest impacts are other things. There are resource use industries. There's the cattle grazing, the ranching industry, there's the forestry. Forestry, when you clear cut a forest, you get an upsurge in grasses, you'll get more horses coming in. So people sometimes worry about population increase in the horses, and that's another controversial thing. But if we are managing our land in a way that invites more horses in, then we're making choices that are actually creating that. Forest fires, another driver in that ecosystem. So again, massive impacts from these kinds of things, more so than the horses. So I want to come back to this idea of different perspectives then, because controversy, if there's not really a clear, we can see there's impacts, we can see that there's other things that are probably having bigger impacts, what are people getting so upset about? Part of it is cultural differences. And when I started doing the interviewing and asking people, I talked to people from all different walks. I talked to government workers from Ministry of Environment, from forestry. I talked to ranchers. I talked to people from different First Nation communities. I talked to people from environmental NGOs. And what I noticed was I needed to listen to not just what people were saying, but how they were speaking. So one of the people I spoke to, a Honeybean knowledge holder, when he started talking about the horses, this is where there's going to be a lot of text, but we'll have time and I'll probably read it, which is that annoying thing. He immediately compared the horses to himself, to his own people. As a scientist, we would say this is anthropomorphizing. But I think there's more to it than that. So the wild horses are like us. They've got roots, they go. They have plans. And remember what I said about traditionally, Honeybean had seasonal rounds that they made. And these wild horses have seasonal rounds that they make. Back. So he starts comparing how they relate to each other in herds. You've got a younger studs that hang out together and an older stud. You've got a mix of young, old stud that learn from each other, just like an elder and a youth. And they move around and they know the places to go. And the ones that are strong take over. Sorry about that. More control from here. The mares are sort of the leaders. Like in our culture, the women have power, they're really strong. So the stud protects the mares, but the mare decides where to go and when. And it's quite interesting, in our culture it's the same. So he's explaining this, and he says, it's really interesting. There's a lot of similarities. And I started, when I thought about this, I thought, it's like I'm listening to somebody talk about his neighbors. It's like I'm listening to someone talk about another family. And there's a lot of writing about Indigenous people from around the world having relationships with wildlife kind of like kin. So there's a lot of theory about that. Now, what's hard for us to accept sometimes is that doesn't preclude killing things. But this is where we get back to what I said before about it's a very different culture. So we tend to have horses as pets, or we want wild horses to be completely untouched. It's a different relationship. This is a relationship where people talk about wild horses, kind of like neighbors. And yet, if there's too many of them, or if they feel like they need to, they'll bring some in, they might sell them, they might castrate them, they might, they'll manage them in a different way. But regardless, it's a very strong bond. And just in case you're worried, this is not a dead horse. This is a horse who had done a long ride that way and was looking a little sore, so they gave him a painkiller and he got kind of sleepy in the afternoon sun. And this is June. The horse's name is Cotton, and June is his owner, and she was just hanging out there, having a nice little snuggle with him. The other one down in the corner is. That was a young bachelor who I believe had just gotten kicked out of his herd. You can see my tape measure beside me in the field there. He came, we heard him coming. He was shrieking. Like he was neighing and he was calling out. He looked about 2 and he came sailing into this meadow and then postured but he spent 45 minutes with us, interacting and backing off and coming back, and I was there with 2 field assistants, and eventually I had to kind of get back to work, and when we stopped paying attention to him, like we had been kind of playing with him a little bit, we'd been sort of neighing back and I'd crawl around on all fours and paw a little and just see what would happen, and he loved it. Eventually when we stopped interacting, the head went down, the tail slumped, and he just kind of strolled out in the meadow. So I remember writing this email to my supervisor afterwards and saying, I had this amazing encounter with this little bachelor, and I think he wanted the new herd, and I got told to quit the anthropomorphizing. So we're getting close to the end here, but there's a key part to what makes this controversial that I didn't stumble upon until I started doing this research. So we know that there's the economic value of the cattle. There's the concerns about them being introduced species. But even that doesn't seem like enough to make them really, the level of emotion that comes up. And what I realized after I started talking to people was there's also history there. Like I said before, this is unceded territory. Managing these horses is part of how people exercise their autonomy. And we've seen how useful those animals were. Before cars, and let me say, up until about the 1990s, people weren't driving in this community. Like, this is how recent, the guys who were on those horses racing, they're in their 50s, they grew up on horseback. So 1989, there were, I think, 5 or 6 cars in the community. Everyone was still paying by horse, getting around by horse. There is a memory of how important access to these wild horses were to people's agency and autonomy. And what I was amazed to find was a PhD student from UBC who had done archival research, found a direct link in letters from an Indian agent in the 1927, linking the management of the horses to trying to force First Nations people onto reserves. So here's an excerpt from the letter. With reference to the matter of trying to persuade the Indians to give up raising useless horses, they argue that with the present shortage of hay, particularly on reserves, they cannot keep cattle. Because remember how adaptable horses are. Whereas the horses can exist after a fashion. These various troubles will not be settled until Chief Chilahitsa and his followers are finally and firmly dealt with and repressed. So there was knowledge on both sides that having access to these horses was a part of the economic well-being and the agency and the autonomy that Indigenous people had. And that managing the horses was part of managing people. Well, you fast forward 80 years or so, 90 years, and most of the people who are working in the Ministry of Forests have no idea about the history. We don't learn that stuff at school. But a lot of the people in the community kind of remember it because their history is oral. They grew up listening to these stories. And so somebody I interviewed in 2009 is saying, well, the forestry department, they wanted us to kill off these wild horses. There was a bounty, and you had to turn in the ears, and that's how people would get paid. Now, BC has a long history of bounties on any species that was considered a pest species, or a lot of the time it's predators like wolves. Out on the coast, they had it on seals because they decided the seals were eating all the salmon, and that's why the salmon stocks were dropping. And the same thing went for horses. So there was a bounty from the 1930s until about the late 60s on horses. You would get, I think people told me, $2 for a pair of ears, $5 for testicles. And Indigenous people were usually encouraged to be the ones doing this. They were also people who had the fewest options and the least money. When the bounty ended, there was still a policy of culls and doing roundups it was usually First Nations people who were encouraged to do this. Now, what's interesting is this isn't just a story of victimhood. I talked to people who had participated in those culls, and part of the reason they did it was they needed money. Part of the reason they did it was they said, if we went out there, we could make sure we left some horses behind. If we didn't do it ourselves, we had no control over how many they took. So there's still an exercise of stewardship, even under duress there, of people choosing to engage in an activity so that they have control over how those horses are managed. Now, one of the interesting things, come full circle now up to 2014, the Chilcotin people won a historic court case after a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of Canada and 25 years in court. They were the first First Nation in Canada to have legally recognized title to a portion of their own territory. So this has changed the legal landscape across this entire country, and the horses were part of that court case. So a huge part of the evidence base was the management, all the things we talked about how they would manage and steward those horses is in the argument of the plaintiff. And the right to continue stewarding those horses and managing them is written into the legal decision that recognizes their title and their rights to their land. So, to wrap up, I'm just going to talk briefly about where are we now. I've talked about some of the initiatives that community has going on. There's other research going on. In Alberta, I was just out visiting a young gentleman. In addition to the Sable Island research, there's a really fascinating population project going on in the foothills of the Alberta Rockies. This is a radio-collared mare, who is one of, I think, 5 horses that currently has a collar on, so they can track their movements and try to find out how widely they're ranging. And this gentleman has over 100 wildlife cameras out to try to use non-invasive techniques to figure out where these horses are ranging. I think there's a lot more research that could be done. Horse management in BC, right now, I'm going to let my bias show. The latest way in which we're scapegoating horses is that there is a massive die-off as moose. And there's certainly claims that the wild horses need to be culled again because they're competing with moose. I haven't seen any science from that region to actually give evidence. If I saw it, I'm an ecologist too, I would agree. I'm like, okay, there we go. But I don't know that that work's been done. We also know that wolves are being culled. And the irony in the Chilcotin is that I'm pretty sure that one of the things that keeps this population of horses in balance is predation. Yep. We actually want predation on those horses. One of the next steps for the Chilcotin, protect the horses, protect the habitat. So this is one of the projects I work for them on. We're writing a management plan for an indigenous protected area that will help to hold that habitat for the traditional uses that people have on that land, including the horses. And I think, to sort of sum it up, so if we're coming full circle back to the beginning, there's wild horses in Canada. If I were to sum up some of the thoughts, I would say just remember that yes, and there's varieties in the horses, just as there's variety in the cultures, and that the management approaches we bring needs to be nuanced. We can't apply blanket solutions. And I've put the foal and the mare there with the skull because from an environmental, ecological perspective, death is part of honoring life. And so, we want the cold winters, we want the predators there because they're part of what's keeping those horses in a healthy state in that system. For the controversy, it's about listening to each other and the implications for how we manage species, predators and the resources and the horses. I think there's a lot of potential for Indigenous knowledge and science to work together. And, there's a chance to learn from other people's way of knowing. So a final thanks that I have to offer. There's many people who mentored and helped me to do this research and who are still teaching me, but three of the ones who became really special to me is former Chief Marilyn Baptiste. She was recipient of a Goldman Environmental Award recently for her work protecting her land against a mine. Chief Roger William, who was the plaintiff in that 25-year court case, and that succeeded. And also David William, who is a gentleman who taught me everything I now know in the bush. When I went out there, I was a complete newbie. And I can now chop wood, light fires, 4x4, and make bannock. So that's thanks to him, who taught me how to watch and find those horses. And my thanks to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya. As has been the process in previous talks like this, there will be a chance for questions. Again, we ask that when you want to ask a question, you put up your hand, and a volunteer will bring you a microphone. We ask that you state your name and where you're from, and then your question, please. Are you ready to entertain questions?
Sure, yes.
Thank you. Mark Pirard from Harvard University. Very interesting. I had the good fortune to be able to visit the Honeygatine for a week when the ISIS conference was in Vancouver. So lots of good memories, and Roger Williams is a really nice man. I remember him. I was just wondering, I had some talks with him, and also some of the things you said about their relationship with horses, because they leave their trained horses sometimes out for winter or 2 years when they don't need them. But when they need extra horses, they just capture new ones. So do they see them as property or as something that they can use and release? How is actually the relationship between the horses and the people? Oops.
Well, it sounds so
Yeah, mic still works.
Is the mic still working, or shall I
Yes.
just pretend? Still good? Okay, well, let's keep going. Good question. Yeah, I think it really is mixed. I think that people the way I heard people talking was that they would often know about one another's horses. They would say, oh, that's so-and-so's mare, she's been out for a couple of years. This colt that you saw, the bay one, well, he was from this mare, but he hasn't been brought in yet. So there's sort of a different, people will talk about both the horses they own, and they do talk about piece property, and release. And then there will be other ones that they've never met before that they refer to as wild, that they will bring in. So it sort of seems to be both, I think. I don't know if that answers the question. That tradition of turning horses out over the winter and then recapturing them is definitely a strong one there, both for the, as I mentioned, both for the ranchers, like the settler ranchers would do that as well as the First Nations.
Question here.
I'm Jonaki from Delaware University. I was just a curiosity. I've seen the picture. They look like more stocky horses than what we are, like the American Mustangs, or so. Am I?
Yes.
So
and
what kind of?
Yeah. That is the million-dollar question. We don't really know, and so there's lots of speculation. There has been some genetic testing that's been done, but to the best of my knowledge, the sampling has been haphazard. So I think there's been a lot of repeat samples from the same horses, because basically I volunteered on that project, and we would just go out and collect horsehair from trees. So we were getting a lot of the same individuals. From the interviewing that I did, people talked about over the years, they didn't really know when the first horses got into that region, but they would introduce stock, sometimes to improve, or to bring out certain traits in the horses that were running wild. And there was also a tradition for a while, I gather, of when somebody died, they would just let their horses go. So people could actually reference, they would say, oh yeah, there was that time that we let a couple of draft horses go, and then somebody brought a thoroughbred in because we needed to lighten them up a little, and so had a polo pony that got loose, and so people will talk about the various stock that they've introduced. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not a geneticist, to the best of my knowledge, the genetic tests have not been conclusive. They've found strong likenesses to the Canadian horse. They've found traces of similarities genetically to Russian Yakut's horse, but I don't know what breeds those traces could have come through. So we do know there's a tradition of domestic horses being released, including draft animals.
Thank you very much indeed. A lovely, lovely talk. I live in New Zealand, and we have Indigenous people who are also very closely associated with horses. They call them hoiho. And there's been some beautiful films made by a colleague of mine about the life of the Maori people with their horses. But I would say that whilst it's very romantic looking at these films and looking at your beautiful pictures, there's quite a lot of traditional use and riding and training of those animals. There's a lot of knowledge that you talked about, which is, and you asked us to keep an open mind. But there's also practices that aren't necessarily in the best interest of those horses. Would you like to give us a comment on how, using the knowledge that you have, you would suggest that we can, in partnership, help people to embrace some of the science that we know can actually help them to have healthier and probably, dare I say it, happier horses when they're being handled and trained?
Yes, that's a lovely question. Thank you for that opportunity. It's absolutely true. And that's I probably didn't spend enough time on some of the negative or more challenging aspects, and I think by alluding to we also don't want to idealize because, as you say, there are some very rough traditions in this area. I think that what I've heard, especially around the work with youth, is an interest from current leaders in having clinics put on for their youth and in inviting horse handlers and experts in to train youth and how to handle them. And I think there's the opening, is responding to those invitations. And if there's an interest in learning new techniques, bingo, let's get in there and talk about where things are at now. Because, tradition is not always the best way, and Indigenous knowledge is partly about learning and trying to recognizing that people have a cultural way of understanding, but it's not static. It's not always doing everything the way it was done and only that. It's about bringing that forward into the future and finding new ways to practice the ethic. And I think science, new horse training techniques, all of that, there's an interest, and there's certainly from the communities I've worked with, there's an appetite. There's an interest in seeing their youth be safer. I've seen, at community events, some of that mountain racing, there are some brutal head injuries in the people and horse deaths that result from that. And you'll see the kids from those families, they've got helmets on when they're riding. So there's interest in new techniques, and I think as it's invited, there's an opportunity to create that dialogue. Some things are also getting dropped off. One of the techniques that the old timers used to use for catching horses, they would snare them. They would set up a giant rope snare in a trail and drive horses straight into it. And then they'd leave them overnight to let them fight it out until they were exhausted, and then they'd take them in. That doesn't happen anymore. And I think people are increasingly interested in new methods. The trick is, who's the first one through the gate to teach the new methods? Is it, a cowboy from from the Western U.S. who has just as rough training techniques? It's a very nuanced thing. So I think there are openings, and I would like to see that dialogue happen as a dialogue.
My name's Pam as well. I'm from Victoria, also from Western Canada. And I have done a little bit of pilot research on the band of horses, the large ranging band of horses in the south of Canada. There's about 1,500 horses wild in that area, and they all originate from the Penticton First Nation. And of course, they're ranging into the suburban communities, which are growing so rapidly in that region, whereas the region that you're talking about is still extremely remote and full of predators, as you point out. And so the conflict has a lot more stigma associated with it because it's so social media dominates the community for communication, and the First Nations take a big hit in terms of respect for the old traditions that they continue to use to manage the horses. And I wonder if you have insight, because you've been doing this for so much longer, about how to approach some of that conflict so that the First Nations can continue to manage the animals as the primary caregivers, owners, however you want to call their relationship with those. The elders that I've worked with in that region are speaking the same way that you've talked about here, and really powerfully attached to the horses as part of their heritage in a really deep way. It's hard to not respect that, and yet what they're doing with the animals is actually
horrific. It's really horrific.
Can you finish the question, please?
Well, I'm trying to understand if you have insight into that particular community because it's analogous, but really different because of this kind of work that's going on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't have a solution. It's tricky. I think part of it is resourcing communities so that when they do want to learn new information and new techniques, they have the resources available to them to do that. Part of it is, ironically, I think also supporting those cultures so that people can share knowledge and continue to learn, because it's when it's broken often, when that knowledge is not, when the good techniques are not passed down from generation to generation, people just start doing whatever. You know, not everything that people do in the community is always traditional. So we need access to resource them, I think, to develop their own ethics and to access the best available techniques and information. But I don't have a solution for it. It's a very challenging situation. And I think that it's hot as well because it very quickly becomes racially and ethnically charged. I lived in Penticton for a number of years, and interestingly, when I went to do my graduate research, I initially thought that I would work in that region, and I chose not to because I actually found the racial politics too triggering for me, and I just thought I've got to step away from this. And yeah, I think for me it was because there was also an Indo-Canadian population there, and it was just so personalized that I needed to step back. So those politics, yeah. You mix like something as emotional as horses with racial politics and contemporary Canadian. Oh my God! There is no easy solution that I understand.
I think we have one question here and then one in the corner. Please keep them brief.
Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm a student at University of Massachusetts. I was just wondering, like I said at the beginning, I actually didn't know if there were wild horses in Canada. But in the States, we have like trainer incentive programs and like the domestic makeover, and you had mentioned that called for population control. I was just wondering if those sort of things were options here in Canada, or if there is just this calling for population control.
It's a great question. I think one of the differences is that in the States, you have legislation. And with legislation comes money. I know that you're underfunded, so don't get me wrong, I'm not idealizing that, but in most of the Western provinces anyway, horses don't actually, like free-ranging horses don't actually have they're not wildlife, they're untended livestock, so there's sort of no, it's difficult to get the resourcing politically to actually address them. The study that I mentioned in Alberta is currently, I think a lot of it's university-driven. That's where some of the work is being done. So they're working with colleagues in Colorado and the States to explore contraception, different techniques for that, and working with a veterinary college at the University of Calgary. So I think that it's often coming from academic quarters here, and they are looking at other options. And often looking to the U.S. There's a lot of cross-fertilization that's happening across the border because of the work that's being done in the States.
We have one last question from the corner. The microphone can go up there, please.
Hi, my name is Joan. I'm from Summerland, British Columbia. I actually live next door, just about to the Penticton Indian Band, and I actually, in fact, own an Indian pony that was part of a forced sale. I guess one of the things, we also have a cattle ranch, so we struggle hugely with all those issues. I mean, I can tell you stories that would just make your hair stand on end. One of the questions I always have is we call them the Indian ponies. They wander through and they die and they starve and all these horrible things happen. But isn't there, to me, if they're wild, nobody owns them. So they've taken ownership of something. That's what I struggle with. in my area because we watch them die all the time. So that's would be my question is like if they're wild, they're wild, but they're not. They're this domesticated animal that there's some kind of convenience that when they need them, they bring them in and they sell them and they make money from them. You can hear where my tilt is because I've witnessed it for 20 years. So so we struggle with it on a ranch and watching the horses come through and starve and be hit by cars and just it's unbelievable because they're restricted by travel because of fences that are up from our ranches from coming through cattle guards and then they can't get back and horrible things like that. But isn't there, to me, that like if it's wild, nobody owns them.
I think
So there's an ownership
I
piece
think
that I struggle with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely, I hear you. You're touching on something that's really part of the crux of it. And the situation in the Okanagan is so intense with so many more of them. And it is akin to kind of what we often see south of the border in the States too, which is the semi-arid landscape that's grazed down so fast, or like it's horses are really hard when they're on that landscape, when they're the population is growing. So I think just to touch on two aspects of what you said, the dynamic with the fencing is something that we see in the Chilcotin as well, not the area where I did my study, and that's partly why I say different management techniques are needed for different areas, because there are areas where you talk to the ranchers and yeah, those horses, they're not moving season by season. People will say they camp out, right? So they're camped out on areas that ranchers want to and need to and have paid to graze their cattle. And by the time it's time to turn those cows out in the spring, the grass is already down to stubble. And in your case, I hear you that there's so many horses that they're in poor condition and they're starving as well, which is where I think we start to get into looking at contraception or whatever the socially acceptable, welfare acceptable solution is to some form of population control, because we don't have free movement in a natural state. We have to accept that we've got highways and urban areas and fencing and all these other things that are influencing how these animals are moving on this landscape, and that means more intensive management from my perspective. The wild thing is a really interesting thing because that is, I don't want to attribute everything to cultural differences, but this idea of differentiating between owned and wild, I think that there really are different perspectives that people bring to that. And so this whole idea of having free-ranging animals that are there and accessible when you want to go get one and bring it in and use it, versus our perspective of it's either wild and it's totally not owned and nobody gets to claim it, or it's owned by someone. Just different. I mean, to me, those are just different perspectives. They're fundamentally different, and they're not always compatible. And I think that from what I've heard, and I don't know if this is useful or not, the access to animals and to use animals as a resource is part of what's the perception of Aboriginal rights. So if we were talking about hunting moose or trapping fur bearers, those are rights that are enshrined and date back constitutionally. And so horses in that sense are perceived as a resource that go with the territory. So there's a sense of ownership that comes with stewardship that can be assigned to horses in the same way as other wildlife. It doesn't fit or jive with how we think of horses in our society. But that's where you get that disconnect, I think, and it's something that has to be negotiated. But I think it's tied to the sense of ownership of land. So wild animals on a certain land are perceived to be there for the use of the people who have the rights to that land.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya.